So we're back with part 2. We've kind of done the first half of our deleting. We've added delete buttons. We've added a confirmation. The user clicks OK. They're looking for a page called delete game, and they're passing in the selected game ID. So our next step is we need to build this page. Now this is going to be a hidden page. All it's going to do is delete from the database and then bring the user back to the games page, which will be updated. So in my root folder, I'm going to make a new PHP file called delete-game, so it matches the href property of our links. So right away, even with no code here, this is going to make our 404 not found error disappear. So now if I click and say OK, we just get a blank page loading right now. So I can change the title. But we don't really need any real content on here because it's all PHP code. We don't actually need any HTML. So let's put on a set of PHP tags. And we'll maybe go through the steps first that we need before we actually write the code. So first thing is get the selected game ID from the URL parameter. So we need to read this value so we know which record in the database we're going to be removing. So we're going to get it from the URL. Then we're going to connect, set up, and run the SQL. What kind of command do we run in SQL to remove something from the database? We've used insert for adding new records. We've used select for retrieving records. What kind of command do we use in SQL if we want to remove something from the database? Colton, drop. Yeah, drop removes an entire table. Delete removes a record. So Ariel, you had, if you were asking, your code that you pasted was like this. You were closing your script tag in the middle of the path. So, okay, good. So we want to run an SQL delete command. We want to disconnect, and then eventually we'll make sure this works. Once we know the delete is working, we will redirect to the updated games.php. We won't enable this part right away because if we get an error, we won't see it because we're going to get taken back to games. So we'll add this once we know the delete is working. So we'll create a variable called game ID. So how would we retrieve the ID from the URL? We can't use post because we didn't submit a form. But what method lets us read any values from our URL? You got it, Colton. We can use get using the get array. So we can read the URL parameter that's called game ID. And then we'll want to make sure that it's numeric. And I'll just move all this stuff inside. So if the game ID is a number, we'll then do our usual database connection. So our database connection that we use all the time. Our SQL command will be delete from, there's no star here. We just delete from games. What else should we add on to this SQL command? It would work the way I've written it, but what's the problem if we just execute delete from games? What result would that give us? Yeah, it would delete everything, which we do not want to do. So we need a where clause. So we're going to pass in our game ID as a parameter. We'll create our command variable just like we have every time we've worked with the database. So we call prepare on our connection with this SQL statement. But before we can execute it, we need to fill or bind our game ID parameter. So we're going to populate it with our game ID variable. And it's an integer. So this way, a user couldn't do this with their browser. Click on the delete link or type in this URL, something like this. We would not want. If they did drop table games, because we're checking that it's numeric, both here as well as here. This would prevent this kind of SQL injection attack. And then to actually run the delete, we just execute our PDO command and disconnect. So we can try this out. We're going to use get to take the ID from the URL, and we're going to store it in a variable. We want to make sure that variable is numeric, and if it is, we're going to connect to the database. We're going to create a delete statement that takes as a parameter the game ID, so we know we're not deleting all the records in the games table. We only want to delete one. And we're going to identify it based on the ID because the IDs will be unique. We'll prepare our PDO command, populate the game ID from our variable, and then execute and disconnect. So after line 20 runs, that game should be removed from the database. So I put this if statement in the chat. I've taken out my password. So you'd have to change the connection, but the rest of the code should be the same for everybody. We could try it out and let's see what happens. We're not doing a redirect yet. We want to make sure that delete works first. So I've got here game ID, bunch of blanks. So this one's totally blank. It doesn't even have a release year. If I delete it and say OK, just gives me a blank screen. Well, there's no error, so that's encouraging. But did the delete actually work? Well, I don't know. I'll go back and refresh. And now you notice that that game is gone. Delete. OK. Click back and refresh. So our delete appears to be working. And it is also deleting the right record. So just knowing that a delete ran isn't enough. We want to make sure we're deleting the right thing. So we only need one more line of code on our delete game page. PHP has a really weird function, a really weird way of handling redirections. So we do redirects all the time. For example, after we log into a site, the page will check our identity against the database, and then it will either send us back to the login page or it will send us to like the home page of the site, or a private dashboard or our profile or something else. Here's how we redirect in PHP. We use the header function and we specify a new location with a colon. So this is going to redirect us, and we can redirect either to another page within our site, or we could redirect and put in a full URL and redirect to another website entirely if we wanted to. So with this redirection in here, this page is now invisible. The user's never going to see it if they delete something. The browser's just going to flicker for a second, and then the games page will reload. So if I delete here, I'll delete new game 3 at the bottom. We should just see a quick flicker in the browser, and then this page is going to reload. So when I say OK, it's not quite instant. The page does have to reload and query the database again. But it's pretty good. If I click cancel, nothing happens. If I click delete, so now we can add, we can edit, we can also delete, and we've also given the user a confirmation. So they have full control now of the ability to add, remove records. And here's all our code. And if our game ID is not numeric, we just skip this part. We don't bother connecting the database. We don't bother trying to delete anything. We just take them back to the games page if they try to change the URL and put in anything other than an integer here. So we're 3/4 of the way to a kind of fully functional web database-enabled web application. We can now add any data we want. We can read the data from the database, and we can delete things that we don't want in there. We'll just leave the code up for a minute. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing on the delete game page? Anything you're not clear about, you have a question about, you want some more explanation for?
Is there a way to edit the data
That's what we're going to do next.
Oh, thank gosh. You're a good man.
Thanks, Chris. Nafisa, you'll have to be a little more specific.
Oh, okay. That's nice to know.
So Nafisa, what happens with yours? Is there an error? You deleted and refreshed. Okay. If you have the redirect, you should comment it out for now because you may see an error message on your delete page. But if the redirect is here, okay, so you don't have the redirect. Okay, does the URL look like this? And does the URL look correct on the delete game? That it looks like this? Okay, if it's not deleting, but you're not getting any error, you can add this here. Add this line of code under your connection. We can add enable database error handling. I'll put it in the chat for you as well. Add this line of code underneath your connection and run it again. And you may get an error message showing you more information. We're going to tackle edit in a minute. Now, we don't need to create any new pages for doing edit. We can do edit within 3 of the existing pages we already have. So we don't need any new pages, but we're going to need to modify 3 of our existing pages. So first of all, on the games page, we're going to make the game titles, we're going to convert those into links. So if a user wants to edit a game, they can just click on any one of the names. When they click on the game, we want to take them here. And Chris, I'll ask you, what should we do on this page if the user wants to edit?
You should add a new edit page.
We could add it as a separate page, but we can actually edit right from here. So if I click a game and get taken here, what should this page look like if we want to edit? Should it be blank like this?
No, it should like have it pre-filled.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is we'll make these links to game details, and just the same way our delete links passed in the ID, we want to pass an ID to this page. And if we have an ID, we want to, as Chris said, we want to fill out the 3 text inputs as well as select the right publisher. And then when we hit save, we'll also need to modify this page. What will we need to modify on our save page? Chris, I'm not picking on you. This could be for anybody. So we're going to have to change this page as well. what will we need to do on our save page? If we look at how it works right now. What does our save page do right now in the database? Does it add, read, update, or delete?
Update.
No, have a look at the code on line 50. It's not doing an update. Is it doing add, read, or delete?
It's adding.
Right. So right now, this page is coded that it only adds a new game. So we're going to need to add some logic here to determine, are we adding a new game or is the user editing an existing game? In which case, if they're editing, we don't want to do an insert, we'll want to do an update. So we'll have to rewrite this page a little bit so it can do both. You broke it? Yeah, it happens. Happens to all of us. Okay, so let's start here by making the game titles links so that we'll take the user here and then we'll have to write the code to pre-populate the page, as Chris mentioned. So go back to our games page. So what we want to do is we're going to wrap the game titles in an anchor tag kind of similar to the delete links. So I'll add in my first column ahref equals game details, game ID equals, and then I need a single quote. So we can right. And then I've got to end the anchor tag. So the first two lines, we were taking the title, we're now wrapping it in an anchor tag, and that anchor, that link, also includes the unique ID for each game. So here are the first two lines now. There's our first column. So this is going to convert those game titles from static HTML text. It's going to convert them to links that we can click. That's going to load our details page. I'm just going to try this out, make sure the syntax is right. Think it is. So these are all links now. Each one of them loads game details and passes in the appropriate ID. Cool. So that was step one. Give the user some way to choose a game so that they could make changes to it. Now, we could have also added another link here. That would work as well. So if beside your delete link, if you had wanted, let's say, an edit or a details link here, maybe you style it with a different color, that would work as well. That just takes up a little more space on the screen to add a button. By making the titles links directly, we're not adding any extra elements to our screen. Saves us space, saves us a bit of bandwidth and download speed by just converting these, which we already have, these text elements here, which we already have, to links. So the games page is done. So our next task is to now add some logic to game details that checks, do we have a game ID in the URL? If we do, the user's editing a game, so we want to pre-fill the form. If there's no ID, we just want the user to get a blank form because it means they're trying to add a new game. So we need to add this logic now to game details. So let's go to our form. So I could write this code up at the top if I wanted to. Let's see. Maybe we'll put it before our form. So we're going to load all this HTML regardless. So we'll put on maybe before the main section. I'm going to open up a set of PHP tags here. Check if adding or editing. If editing, get values to populate the form. So we'll say if not empty, our get game ID. So this means if we have an ID in the URL, if we've got an ID, we want to grab it from the URL with get, just like we did on our delete page, right? Same thing. We're going to get the game ID, read it with the get array, and store it in a variable. In this case, we need to look up the selected game in the DB. So we're going to need to connect to MySQL. Oops, sorry. So we're going to connect to the database if we are editing. In this case, we've got a where clause, right? We don't want all the games. We only want this selected game. So we'll use the same where clause we did on our delete page. Ignore everything in the games table except this one game. This is the only one we care about. We're not doing anything with any of the other records in this table. Okay, so we're going to get the ID out of the URL, store it in a variable. We're going to connect to the database, and then we want to fetch this record. So we'll create our command as usual. We have to populate our game ID from our variable. and we'll set it as an integer. So this line of code, again, exactly the same as what we did on the delete page. And then we execute our query. Now, when we've queried the database before, we did it on our games page. Here. We ran a query, we executed the query, and we called fetch all. On our game details page last week, we did the same. We queried the list of publishers. We called fetch all. Because in this case, we're selecting a list of records. This query is going to be a little different. How many records are we selecting here? We're going to get back one record, or could we get back a list of records? With the query that's highlighted in blue. How many games could have this same ID? Right, just one. So in this case, we can use a bit of a shortcut. We can use fetch all, but fetch all requires us to loop through the results. We're only going to have one result, so using a loop isn't really necessary. It actually slows the page down. So in this case, use fetch, not fetch all, as we're only selecting a single record. You don't need a loop. Exactly, David. It's like hunting a rabbit with a tactical nuclear strike. So I'm just going to create a game variable, and I'll just call fetch. So we can see the different fetch methods that come with PHP. We've been using fetch all. That gives us an array. We just want to call fetch. Just more efficient. Fetch all would work, but fetch is faster. So all this stuff is if we have a game ID in the URL. When we're editing, we'll have an ID. When we're adding, there's no ID because we want a blank page. And then I'm going to add an else. If no ID, we are adding. So initialize the game variable to null. So we're going to create a variable called game either way. But if we're not editing, we want to initialize it to null. I will put this block up on Pastebin. We're not done with it yet. Be nice if this loads. So I'm taking out the connection, so you'll need to put your connection back in. But here's the link if you missed anything. So then what we need to do, we've written this code above our form that will fetch the selected game when we have an ID in the URL. We then need to use this game to populate, as Chris said, we want to populate our inputs. We'll deal with the text inputs first because they're a little easier. The drop-down is a bit more complicated. So on line 57, I'm going to find my first input for the title in the form. And what I want to do is set the value property. Maybe I'll just wrap it to a new line. And in here, we can open PHP tags. And I want to echo out our game title. So this should print the title property of our game into the first input. I'm going to try just this, and we'll see if it works before we do the release year and the rating. Let's go back, click on Tetris, and with this ID, it fetches the right game and displays the title. I pick different game. Right. Whatever game I pick, the title is now the existing title value is populated. So we want to do the same things now for the year and the rating. We want to echo these values back into the form. So I'm going to do that here as well. On my release year, we'll set a value, open PHP tags, and again, print out the game release year. So that's going inside our value attribute. We open and close the PHP tag inside of that HTML property. And I'm going to do the same thing with the rating. Our value equals we want to print out with an echo command the game rating inside of our third input. So lines 58, 63, and 68. Oops. That's allowing us to print these values. So I'm going to go back and refresh, try some games again, and my form should be populated each time. So if I refresh, using the ID, grabbing the ID from the URL, querying the database for this record, and fetching it into a game variable. And then with this game variable, we can print out the different column values from the database, the title, the release year, and the rating, into the corresponding inputs. So whichever game I pick, I get my form loading. So it's almost done. There's two more little things we need to do on this page. What about the drop-down list? What's the problem? What's the issue with the drop-down list? What are we going to need to do about our publisher? What's missing? Anybody see a problem, an issue with the drop-down list? I should also disconnect here. Thank you, David, right? It just defaults to the first option for every publisher. It prints the list, but it shows Activision, which is not the correct publisher for every game. So we haven't written any code. We haven't indicated which option should be pre-selected in the dropdown. So what we'll need to do, in this echo, we're going to need to compare the current publisher ID with our publisher ID of the current game. We'll need to compare those, and when they're the same, we want this option to be selected. So it's a little bit complex. Probably you may need a little catch-up time. So I'm going to upload this now to GitHub, so you can refer to it if you need to get caught up. We will take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to write the code to select the publisher. And then we'll need to modify our save page so it can do an insert when there's no ID, or an update when there's already an existing game ID. We should be able to finish all of that today. I'm going to pause my recording and upload. We will take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and resume at 1 o'clock.